It's with tremendous pleasure that we are welcoming Jay with us this evening for this webinar about loss and grieving. Jay and the GATLA also has been a big support for us since like 2 years ago, since the Beirut explosion. And we had the opportunity to benefit from a lot of trainings and workshops, thanks to you, Jay, and your colleagues. And I want also to thank Bob. I don't know if he's here.
I'm here.
Oh, hello. Oh, okay. You have the name, Jay. Yeah.
He's got my name written under his face.
Yeah. Yes. You can change the name if you want to. So as I was saying that we had the opportunity to benefit from a lot of trainings, individual also therapy and support and supervision. Us at Al Najat Village, our association with the group of psychologists. For this, we had also the opportunity to offer a lot of help for people, Lebanese, but also refugees in Lebanon, who were suffering from traumas and all kinds of issues, obviously. Our work is volunteer work. And so that's why we were able actually to continue, and we are still continuing to help a lot of people, thanks to you. Thank you so much, everyone. About tonight, I would like to first introduce Jay. For those who don't know him, Jay has practiced and taught counseling and psychotherapy for over 35 years. His interest in how values shape personal behavior and therapeutic interventions is mirrored in published articles that reflect his vision of a more hospitable world. Jay is certified by Gestalt Therapy Institute of Los Angeles. He is a professional member of the American Counseling Association and an accredited supervising member of the European Association for Gestalt Therapy, as well as training director for the Gestalt Institute of the Gulf Coast. A major aspect of his professional life is his ongoing affiliation with Gestalt Associates of Los Angeles, where he has been guest faculty for over 30 years. Now, to talk a little bit, to introduce a little bit the webinar, it is aimed at a practical approach to understanding the phenomenon of loss and managing its emotional and psychological consequences. Jay will be exploring a way to address the theme of loss and its significance in the context of change and growth. We understand that loss accompanies the normal and healthy process of maturation and growth. Nevertheless, not all experiences of loss can be categorized in the normal or healthy range. So Jay will explain the distinction between the process of maturation and growth and the interruptions of these processes that interfere with healthy ways of managing loss and grief. After Jay's presentation, there will be time, I hope, for discussion and alternative points of view. So Jay, the floor is yours.
Okay. Thank you for that, Maria. It's quite an honor for me to be here and to be speaking to so many people. It's a little bit frightening, actually, but I hope I'll survive it. Should be fine. If you would like to, it might be interesting to see what country you're from, if you want to put that behind your name. Just see, I don't know how many different countries are represented here. That might be interesting. You do not have to, but that would be fun. So I'm a very practical sort of person, and I thought that rather than going into too much of a theoretical blah 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 about this, the time is here now for a really practical approach to dealing with loss and grieving. For so many reasons, this place, which we call the world, has been under a lot of stress for a few years now, both natural problems, which include climate change, which it brings its own set of challenges and losses for people, as well as human-made disasters, which we are currently witnessing at the moment in many parts of the world, but very notably, obviously, in Ukraine. There's a real need, I think, for being able to work with the victims of these kinds of difficulties. When loss is traumatic, it is a very, very difficult process. And I'm going to make a distinction here between the loss which is traumatic and what is required, and the everydayness of loss, which is actually a healthy process that we deal with every day. Loss is not something that requires, by definition, psychotherapeutic or other kind of assistance. It's a healthy process, like attachment. Loss is simply another way of describing detachment. When we move closer to something and a relationship forms, everything, these events have a beginning, a middle, and an end. These relationships change. We call it growth. And then there's loss involved because the old relationship that was useful is now not so valuable anymore. We need to find a way to manage those losses that arise, which are not pathological. The experience of loss does not automatically mean pathology, but we have found a lot of people struggling with it, and that loss has become a very big part of people's being stuck, feeling helpless, vulnerable, and unable to be able to manage any healthy contact in the face of such tremendous loss that they're experiencing now. I think the other area where is even more of a demand, if that's possible, is in the area which is not my expertise, but the area of working with children who are experiencing loss because of trauma, traumatic events in the field, traumatic events in the environment that deprive the children of safety, love, care, and makes them very vulnerable. They're very vulnerable to start with, and there's a real need for people to work directly with children. We cannot work with parents or in families with children now. It used to be the preferred way, maybe, because the parents and the families are traumatized themselves and also split up. So we need to also find ways of working directly with children, and a lot of people don't do that. I'm just making an appeal. If there are people involved who are interested in child and adolescent therapy, you are very needed at this point to educate and teach. That's not my area. So coming back to this, I want to simply start with the idea that living from a Gestalt point of view what I call a situated event. It's an event, a process that takes place in a context. And the context of the event is defined by relationships. So it's a situated event of relatedness. It may sound like a mouthful, but it's quite simple, really. Everything that we live here and now, we live in and through our relationships with others here and now. That's all I mean by a situated event of relatedness. In other words, our lives have a history, a temporal trajectory through time, and they are located at a specific place. Change, which is part and parcel of natural process of maturation and growth, these processes or relationships change, and they may be very immediate and sudden, or they may be gradual. Now, these changes, in general, change is normal. Change is where we start with Gestalt. Everything is in change. Change is the only constant. So when we talk about change, we're talking always about coming into and leaving. Something is coming into your awareness, something that you relate to, you work with that, you respond to that event, and then the event runs its course and it's time to let go and move on. This is a very basic idea that those of you who know Gestalt therapy probably would not find controversial. I'm going to have a lot of these assumptions in Gestalt therapy. So what I'm saying here is that grieving, which goes with loss, is actually an everyday human experience. It's not something that is unusual. It's not something that is, oh my gosh, we have to do something to stop it. It's something that is actually a natural process of detachment. The grieving process is essential for this to occur in order for the next to arise. Every relationship, when it runs its course, is then experienced as loss at the point where it's run its course. Now, these relationships are emotionally complex and multidimensional. They are not something that you can have a black or white way of grieving, because relationships are not black or white events. They're incredibly complex, and we need to be open to a variety of ways and experiences that people bring in order to express their grief in a way that allows them to let go of those relationships. We're always relating to people, places, things, including losses, for example, a loss of situations that we may not experience. We may not have experienced it. We may have a fantasy of how I think things will work out, and that my plans and ideas are blown up, they're gone. And that fantasy or that idea, which was a foundational idea in my here and now living, is now gone. I have to find a way to let go of that. Similarly with the past, those are experiences we've had that we can grieve through parents and stuff, but sometimes experiences from the past can be sensed as a loss of adequate parenting. How do you say goodbye to the parent who was never there for you, for example? So it's not just something that you feel bodily, but you experience a lack as well. And it's really important to understand that loss is so pervasive and natural that we need to be open to all different possibilities of having to deal with loss and the grief that goes with it. All right. What I'm basically saying so far is that grieving and mourning is a healthy process of detachment. It's how we move on. And this provides a robust or a strong background. This healthy process provides a strong background for us for the emergence and support of new and novel figures of interest. With that possibility that we are not stuck in the past by holding on to relationships that Bob Resnick calls anachronistic. They're out of time. They are in the wrong time, and we have to let them go. And instead of that, we live in the past with these anachronistic relationships. We cannot let go, and we stay in the past. We'll come back to that later when we look at the main difficulties when grieving is interrupted. We constantly find ways to transform our relationships in a healthy way. We have to find a way to recognize the essential aspects of a relationship, which is to identify accurately the place and time when we might say enough is enough. I'm satisfied now, and it's time for me to let go. Whether it's a simple event like having a meal and knowing when it's enough, or a more complicated situation of a relationship that is not working very well and knowing when that's enough and I need to say goodbye. And how do I do these things in a healthy way? This is the objective. How do we do this detachment in a healthy way? It can be difficult because we're often not taught adequately how to manage these situations. We're only taught how to accumulate and take more and more. We're not taught enough how to let go, how to allow something to go away. So we hold on to things that are really useless much of the time. Now, the process of detachment, the healthy process of detachment, is what we call, generally we call grieving and mourning. Okay, grieving is, it's a difference that may not make a big difference. But grieving is the experience of loss from the inside. It's personal. It's how I experience the loss of a relationship for myself personally. Nobody can see except through your expression of emotion, but can't feel your feeling. But they can see that something's happening. And this is what is commonly called grieving by some people. Okay, they make a distinction between grieving and mourning, which is that mourning is something which is you can observe from the outside. It's an active process. You see how a person mourns, but you can't feel their grief, but you can see how they mourn. You can see how they either withdraw or don't withdraw, or express themselves or don't express themselves, how they contact the environment, how they use rituals that are available for them to structure their grief. And then their mourning becomes something of a public event. It's not just personal, because when we have these losses, there's a personal change in relationship, but that changes your relationships with others. And others are publicly appraised of this change. You are treated differently when there's a change, and not necessarily a bad change. You may be treated differently when you get a promotion at work. Now, you've changed your job from one level or status to another, and you find suddenly, people find suddenly that they feel unhappy with the promotion, believe it or not, because their usual skills of managing their old situation at work are now redundant. They don't work. Or a person chooses to get married, it's the happiest day of their life, but then they find that certain relationships have changed and been colored by this mark of marriage, and now they feel their freedom and their opportunities for doing things that they could do in the past suddenly disappear, and they may not be happy with that. So how we adjust to that loss, the loss of the old life, because change will always bring that along. So how we manage to understand that every change involves a change in relationship. And this is something that when we're mourning, it's important that the public eye can also address these changes in status and give space to a person who needs to find a new existential identity in this new place. Am I going too fast, or is this okay so far? Any comments? Okay. All right. Please don't be shy. I'm terrified, so you don't have to be shy. It's okay. Okay. Everybody is familiar, I think, with the Kubler-Ross's work many years ago about grief and dying, death and dying, where she identified various, I think, 7 stages that people go through from her work. It was groundbreaking work and very important work, and has been carried on by some people and modified also in some ways. The essential stuff, and I'm going to try and show it on the screen here. Those of you probably know it. Where is it? Can you see this screen or nothing?
Yes, we can see your screen. I think you need to share only the PowerPoint. Okay, now it's fine.
You can see the PowerPoint. Okay.
Yes.
So the PowerPoint just shows these stages from Kubler-Ross: shock, denial, pain and guilt, anger, bargaining, depression. Then after that, she talks about the upward turn and the healing process that takes place.
I'm sorry, Jay. Sorry, we lost the PowerPoint.
Oi.
Yeah. Okay, now it's back.
It's back.
Yeah.
Okay. The upward turn, and then the healing part, how one finds a way to move on. That was the original model, and I think it's still a useful model. What has changed is the idea that there's a logical or phenomenological sequence to these steps of grieving that we can identify, and we track it like a railway line going through various stops, various stations. I think it turns out that there is really no single correct way to grieve. All right, these emotions and deals and relationships that Kubler-Ross is talking about all do occur, but they're not as discrete as we would like to think, and they don't follow such a nice, orderly pattern. So we come to a place here where we understand, and I'll show another screen here. Oops. All right, you can see it, I hope, where what I'm saying is that personal grieving is unique. It's idiosyncratic, it's personal. It's important here to honor one's loss and give oneself the time and space to experience, feel, and express your feelings. Grief reflects the significance and meaning that is uniquely attributed to the relationship by the mourner, the person grieving. So grieving may be intense, it may not be so intense for other people, because that reflects the quality of the relationship that the person had and was capable of. But grieving is always there. Experience of loss is there to some extent. So quite simply, there are as many ways to mourn as there are grievers in process. There are many ways to grieve. There's no, your way is not the wrong way or the right way. It's just your way, how to grieve, how to move on. Let's see. When the process is allowed to function as it should, in a healthy way, uninterrupted, supported by the environment, supported by rituals and rites of passage that invite the person to share their grief publicly, to experience support and supportive relationships, to express themselves without being told how to share their feeling, or that what they're feeling is not right, or something like that. When it's allowed to go in a healthy way, uninterrupted, that process can lead to healing. You don't need to be a qualified therapist. You need to be a qualified human being. And then you can be with some other who is suffering from loss. It's not about learning a skill. It's about being present and being available, and not trying to manipulate or manage the process for the person grieving. When this is running without interruptions, normally, this is good, this is fine. There's nothing you need to do but be present and in some way stand out of the way. You're present as a support, but you don't need to do more. You don't need to comment, you don't need to understand, you don't need to explain. You just have to be available for the person to tell their story of their grief. And it can change from sadness to anger, to rage, to fear, to helplessness, all in the space of an hour. And to allow that process to be expressed in words with you present is a very important thing. Grieving does not occur in a healthy way. Dealing with loss does not happen in a healthy way when the person is isolated. Now, some people say, well, yes, but I will go home and then I will cry. by myself or whatever, or I will grieve by myself. You can try. It's not going to lead to anything significantly healing. The presence of another is a relationship which is healing. Without that contact, without that capacity for another human being to witness and see and be there while the person grieving is experiencing their grief and sharing the contact with another, that is the healing process. You cannot, I don't believe it's that possible for a person to grieve on their own in a healthy way, that will suffice. There are lots of rules that people have about not wanting to grieve in public. And so they interrupt themselves that way. And there are also rules that other people in the public have that, oh, it's unseemly to show your grief. You need to just go away, grieve, and then come back when you feel better. This is a ridiculous idea, which we have cultivated over many, many, many years. However, it's interesting to note that every spiritual tradition in the world has a formulation, if you like, of how to grieve. There's no spiritual tradition that does not actually have its own rite of passage and its own opportunity to invite people who are grieving to share their grief in the community. It is a very important point, because I think it's been recognized for years that you cannot grieve alone. So I doesn't matter which tradition you're from, or even a spiritual tradition, if it's not a regular one. Everywhere there is some kind of ritual that is part and parcel of the grieving process, which finds its place in order to create some kind of closure for the person. And you cannot have that ritual in isolation. If you're doing it in isolation, it's what we call obsessive compulsion, and doesn't lead anywhere, doesn't change anything. So we come to this place where the personal history of grieving is the one place where interruptions occur. How we are raised, how we learn, the social conventions that we have interjected to believe how we should behave when we're suffering from loss, how you have to behave in a manly way, or a special, strong way, or be resilient, or messages like that, mostly around the interject of self-mastery. How can we master our emotions adequately so that we don't disturb anybody else, and we can be not, we don't have to disturb anyone because we are master of our own emotions. Well, that's a great way to interrupt the grieving process, and it just doesn't work. So there's the personal history that is a huge interruption in many cases. I think most of us have heard of that old saying, do not speak ill of the dead. Well, quite a few people, if they need to grieve adequately and fully, have some ill feelings towards the person who is the other in that relationship that is over. It's not all just love. If you're only going to stick with that, you're leaving out part of the relationship. And we'll see that this becomes a problem later on also, like the depression. So when there's certain interruptions of grieving are personal, they're interjects, they get in the way, and we can identify them and work with them with people when they begin to express, and you can see how they avoid contact with that. The second area where interruptions occur are what I call toxic field events. Here, there are rules, public rules that interfere with the expression of grief, and they do not invite people to share their loss. Sometimes it's overt and blatant, as when militaries do not wish to state the number of losses and honor the losses that have happened. And the expectation is that you be quiet, don't make a sound, because it decreases morale, or whatever the reason, or because the leader looks bad, or whatever that reason. Then there's also socioeconomic expectations, you know. So you lost an important person, but you still got to be at work the next day. Pull yourself together. And these cultural inventions do not serve the human need to experience and manage a loss and grief. They interrupt and interfere with that. So we're left sometimes in some cultures with very little opportunity to adequately heal after a loss of a relationship. And that healing goes to a very deep place. Where the healing is needed is when a relationship is ruptured or damaged or lost in some way. It goes to the core sense of identity. We are the constellation or the network, I don't know how to put it, of our relationships. There's no me and then there's a relationship. There's the relationship and then there's me. I am I because you are you. And at least that's my understanding of Gestalt therapy. The relationship is primary. And that relationship is the fundamental, those relationships that constellate and converge around my experience become my identity. So when these relationships are changing and moving and new ones come and old ones go, if I cannot sustain that support for change, my identity becomes rigid. I become unable to adequately manage my awareness of what's going on and my contact in the world. So these things can become very huge obstacles when there's a lack of these opportunities for human grieving when there's loss. We find that this kind of education can start very young, can start with children. Give another picture here. How we protect our children from the damages and ravages of loss. We do it by believing that children should not be exposed to certain experiences. It's not good for them. particularly I'm talking about normal human events, not talking about a war situation. But the child in the supermarket who is having a fit because he cannot have a candy when the parents take them past the candy shelf. And then the child has a fit and the parent does what many parents do, which is to shut them up, take them out the store, yell at them, tell them to be quiet, stop the shouting, rather than affording them, the kid, the opportunity to express their sadness that they cannot get what they want right now, the loss of that object, and to give them the language to talk about how they feel about not getting it. I'm not talking about just giving the candy to the kid. I'm talking about assisting the kid to be able to come to terms with the idea that some relationships are not going to happen. This is not going to happen, and it's painful. And when I'm painful, I cry, and you can cry. And then when you're done crying, we'll go back. But it's this denial that children learn, that their need to express is unimportant. It's insignificant. And so they learn to stop it up. They learn to block it. And that becomes a lifelong lesson, these kinds of things. It's not just about the candy. It may be a lifelong lesson when there's a lack of love in the family, when there's a lack of safety, there's a lack of respect for the kid. Eventually they give up trying to get those needs met, and they become desensitized. They just give up. And this is because they have not been allowed to find a way to support themselves adequately in this place. So what I'm saying is how kids learn to deal with loss is how they learn to mourn and to grieve, I should say. All experiences of loss are significant. It's not for me to decide if your experience of loss is significant or not. It's for you to decide that. I don't get that call, but I take that as significant. If you are experiencing loss, then that's what matters. How do I respect that experience and not try to subvert it or deflect it or something else? So this is one of the things that becomes therapeutically useful or important when you're dealing with somebody who is stuck with in grieving. Actually, I read recently, it's probably not that recent, but I read recently that there's a new diagnosis in the DSM, which is the American Diagnostic and Statistical Manual, which talks about the pathology of prolonged grieving. And I can't help but smile about this idea, because I don't think there can be something like prolonged grieving. I think that there can be prolonged avoidance of grieving, which looks like grieving, but that's not grieving. So I'm just curious what the criteria are for them to put this in as a pathology now, because either they're grieving or they're avoiding the grieving. And I think that when you avoid grieving, then you end up grieving, sitting with the unresolved grief for years and years and years, and living in the past. And if that's what they mean by unresolved grieving, I just don't see that by prolonged grieving. I don't see that as useful at all, because if grieving is happening, it's healthy and it will not be prolonged. This doesn't make sense to me. But maybe some psychiatrists or psychologists can make workshops about that. All right. So I talked about identity and the issue of relationships changing impact directly on identity, and the major interruptions here existentially are shame, anxiety, and guilt. Here we find different dimensions of struggle for clients who are dealing with loss and grief. They can feel shame and so hide from try to hide their situation, anxiety, and experience panic attacks even, and guilt. Now, guilt is by far one of the most common ones, I think, with grieving. They interrupt their grieving because they feel guilty. They don't want to deal with the unresolved, unfinished business of the relationship because the relationship has been ruptured, and expressing your guilt, your unfinished business to that in that relationship feels, we're told, is not okay. It's all got to be, you're only allowed to say certain things. You're not allowed to say other things, but there may be a lot of other things that need to be said in contact in order for the person to be able to feel that that's enough now. I've done that and I can move on. So I'm not going to go into these particular, because of time, these particular ways of interrupting grieving, but I'm going to rather focus only on the management of guilt here. We talk about neurotic and existential grieving. Now, neurotic guilt is, or neurotic grieving is when I organize my grief around avoiding or managing my anxiety. And this is usually something that is a part of an introject that we have learned, that we then decide this is how I'm supposed to handle my loss. And then I call it neurotic because it's fundamentally organized around some kind of introject, some kind of unassimilated experience that does not have a place in the person's identity. It's not assimilated, it's not integrated. So they almost split off, and they act like they're grieving and do all the things that they should do, but they don't experience the sense of ability to let go, because they still hold on to the introject, the idea of how they should behave. Existential grief is different for me in the sense that it's organized not around the guilt of the introject that tells you what you should do, but around the guilt of some kind of violation of your own core values. When you do not respect and recognize your own core value, and you break that relationship, which is established over the course of a lifetime, now that we have an existential dilemma. Who am I? Am I the person who I wanted to believe I was all these years? Or am I really, are my core values, is my core value somehow different and I was not aware of it? And now I have to be challenged to adopt and to assimilate that unfinished business, which a new experience offers me. That's quite a challenge. And that's why I call it existential guilt. But it comes down fundamentally to what are my values? My values are what I live by. And sometimes for some people, what I die by. But these values are not easily negotiable. These values, the difference between the neurotic grief and the existential grief is the changes with the neurotic grief are more like the different waves coming onto the shore, and they all look different each time. It's a momentary thing. But the existential guilt is more like the changes that you observe as a mountain changes over time. It's really slow and really takes a long time and is much more fundamental about the identity of that person than the moment by moment resources that I can manage to manipulate. So it's a different pace completely when we're dealing with that. So existential grief, which is where we need to get to somewhere, this is grieving that is authentic. It's genuine, it's forgiving, it's compassionate. Here the person finds their capacity to understand and tolerate the good and the bad in the other, in the relationship and in themselves. And this capacity digs deep into somebody's humanity rather than the neurotic kind, which is much more, well, let me do what everybody else does, and I will pay the priest $100 and then I'll be okay. I don't have to do any more about my relationship. That kind of superficial, more superficial, conventional approach, which doesn't necessarily touch the core values that the person has. I want to finish off. Whew. The most important work when I'm working with the situation of loss and grieving is to facilitate for the client and with the client their capacity to the best that they can manage for contact, for being in contact with their feelings of loss and guilt, their feelings of a rupture in a relationship, to be able to express everything about that relationship, even if the person has died, not about the relationship, but to the person. This is not a therapy of talking about. That doesn't help, in my experience. It's about talking to. It's about inviting a dialogue. It's about inviting your client to share themselves honestly and authentically with the other, that they need, with everything they need to say, which is appreciations, what they appreciated about that relationship, about their regrets, what they regret about the relationship, and importantly, about their resentments, what they really resented about the relationship. Now, some people, if it was a horrible relationship, all they want to talk about is their resentments, and that's missing the boat. It's a package deal. It's all or nothing. It's not just, I hated you, you were a terrible person, and I'm so glad you've gone, goodbye. No, I think the person, I'm going to invite the client to dig a little deeper, to check all the boxes, because relationships are much more complex than that. And it could be love. I only want to tell you how much I love you and nothing else. Also, shortcut, it's a deflection. And I don't think that that will, I mean, it's a start, but it will not be enough to cover the vicissitudes and the different nuances of a relationship. It's very important that all these unexpressed or unfinished situations in the relationship can find voice, can be voiced. And the therapist or the other here is job, I think, is to witness primarily, to bring their presence to bear, to witness the person's experience and their idea of their relationship in a non-judgmental way, and to interrupt them when they deflect. To just say, well, when they say, well, after 5 minutes, I've said everything I want to say, I'll say, well, maybe, but take a moment. What else? What else have you not said? And you'll be surprised how it doesn't take much for them to come up with the next thing and the next thing. But I'm very mindful of the different categories. I don't trust somebody where it's only loving comments or hateful comments or just regrets. I don't trust that that person is fully invested in committing themselves to saying what they need to say. And if they're not fully committed to that process, then they cannot be fully committed to the last step, which is to say farewell, goodbye, and to mean it, and to feel the weight lift, and to say, okay, now there's some peace, I'm satisfied now. This is what I need to do. So it can be grueling sometimes, but it's not your work you have to do, it's the client's work. And your work, I think, or my work, is to support the client wherever they go, as long as they're not deflecting, to support their contact with being in touch with the capacity for contact with their loss, the experience of loss, and to express it fully. I'm going to stop here for now. Sure, there's lots of things that I haven't said, but it's been an hour, and I think that's a long time. So I want to leave a little time if people want to, if you guys have comments, suggestions, disagreements.
We have a question in the chat.
Yeah.
Can you discuss when a traumatic event is the introduction to grief? From Ralph.
What? I didn't get that question. What's the question?
Can you discuss when a traumatic event is the introduction to grief?
When a traumatic event is an introduction to grief. Sure.
Sorry, introjection. I will write it. Introjection. Sorry about my accent. Introjection.
Is a what?
Introjection. It's easier in French. Introjection. Introjection.
Is a what? An interruption of
yeah, it's in the chat.
Yeah. You know, I'm looking at how, when I talked about how children learn to desensitize, how they learn to interject certain values, certain ideas, certain behaviors, which interrupt their capacity for staying in, they learn very early that it's not okay to show that they're upset about something, for example. And they learn that if they want to maintain their relationship with a significant other, they have to listen that the significant other does not want to hear about this child's difficulty or pain or whatever. And they need to, and the child then needs to interject or learn how to desensitize themselves from their experience of loss when that happens. These, what I call a traumatic event, is a situation where a person feels overwhelmed by the environment, for example, in a situation where they are overwhelmed, helpless, and vulnerable at the same time. And nobody and nothing supports them. And this is ongoing. It's ongoing or frequently happening. I'm not talking about the one-off situation where, okay, I missed my 4 o'clock in the morning feed and I was upset. That's not trauma. I'm talking about an ongoing situation of neglect, of where the need is unmet, invalidated, and there's in the context where the person is helpless and vulnerable at the same time. In other words, that's, for example, a great situation of shame, shaming somebody. That's very traumatic. And that can become an interject of how to desensitize oneself completely from a situation. I'm not sure that answers the question though, but that's what I'm thinking of. Does that answer the question?
Actually, Ralph just added in the chat that maybe someone might use the trauma to avoid grieving. So they cannot grieve because of the trauma. I'm not sure what kind of trauma. I don't know if Ralph can.
Yes. I think that happens. I think that's what some people are now calling prolonged grieving. I think it's a way of hanging on to the past. It's a way of staying with an anachronistic relationship that is over, refusing to let it go, and just hanging on to that traumatic event of situated victimhood, that they can hold on to that. And I'm thinking of another expression of Bob's, what he calls terminal innocence, that the person constantly comes back to yes, but, the yes, but situation. And the yes, but is a very important, I think, indicator that that is exactly what somebody is doing. They're hanging on and hanging on instead of grieving. They're avoiding the grieving. It's yes, but. And that becomes, it's a dead giveaway that they do not wish, or they do not have the support. I'm not sure which. Sometimes it may be support. But they're not willing at this point to make a commitment to let go, to move on, and to experience the loss and the grieving that is required, healthy grieving that is required in order to move on or move into the here and now. They want to stay in the past with that old thing. I think that's very common with interruption with grief. And that's the guilt. That's guilt also. They feel guilty. How can I let that go? How can I move on? How is it possible for me to be happy if blah, 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 something happened to my mother, my father, my brother, my sister, my uncle, my dog. How can I move on? That's just not right. And so they hold on to it, and it's their choice. But I think it's as I didn't say in the beginning. There's a nice quote here where he says that. He says loss is inevitable. The suffering is optional. Okay. So that would be an example. Yes, but.
I have something about what you just said. Some people go a little bit further, saying, how can I actually not go on, live? So it's like any signs of living would make them feel so guilty. It's like they are dead, you know, they are also dying, but the dead already dead with them.
Yeah.
How can you, as a therapist, how can you accept this?
What do you mean? How do I accept this?
You know, how do you listen to this? How do you receive this from someone who is saying in a certain way that they want to, you know, stop living?
Yeah, my life has come to an end. My life is meaningless now that my partner has died. Now that this has happened. And at that moment when they say it, it may feel true. I'm not going to argue with them, but I'm not going to let it stop there. I'm not going to argue. That's how you feel right now. That's phenomenologically accurate. But for me, I think that's one of the very typical reactions that people feel. How do I live without these significant relationships? Of course, it feels painful. And of course, if I'm going to make the decision to live, how can I do it without feeling guilty? It's complicated, but it's not impossible. The grieving process allows, for me, it allows for that process to happen in the presence of another person who's non-judgmental and accepting. I'm not going to get in a fight with them. But I do think that sometimes just voicing it, saying it out loud, hearing themselves say it, and not being judged for it, gives pause for them to try saying something different also. I don't think it's not a one session cure. This can be, a long time, but it's a great question. Many people do. I worked once with a mom whose child died, son died. Her son was about 17. And she was ready for this work though. And she raged. She raged. It was in a workshop and it was a group of people, which I think was helpful. She really let it all hang out, as we say in America, just not holding back anything. All her anger, her sadness, her fear, her everything towards her son about the injustice of it all, how this was just not okay. She raged on for about 40 minutes. Basically until she was exhausted. And then she became quiet and I checked and I said, what's going on now? She said, well, I actually feel much better. And I saw her the next day and she actually was better. She had not relapsed into that depression. So, I mean, it's the only time that's happened with me, but it can happen. I'm not trying to make that happen. She was ready. She was really ready to climb in, as we say, boots and all, and hold nothing back and say everything that needed to be said. And then she could say farewell, goodbye. It's not as if you don't have a relationship after that. What you're saying goodbye to, and this is important, is that you're saying goodbye to the old relationship. When she did that, she now could, for the first time, begin to get a glimmer of a sense of a different and new relationship with her son, that he was with her in some way. And this was a comfort for her. It wasn't just a source of pain now. But she needed to let what you're letting go of, what you're saying farewell to, is the old relationship that keeps you stuck in the past. So what I'm fond of saying, and maybe some people may disagree, is that healthy grieving is the opposite of depression. If you interrupt your grieving, you get depressed. Depression is another word for interrupted grieving. It's living in the past, living with these relationships that you won't let go of. And that makes sense to me. But it's really difficult for some people to let go because they fear there'll be nothing there if I let go. If I let go, won't I just drown and disappear? And that's the, I don't know what to call it. It's a deliberate, you can call it an act of faith if you like. It's a deliberate commitment to step into the unknown and find, hey, there's something there which I didn't know. But you cannot know that there's something here now if you're living in the past. Of course, it's risky. That's why the therapist sits and is present for the contact. The contact is healing. It's not your technique or your interpretation, especially interpretation, that helps. Yeah. Yeah.
Thank you, Jay. Also, we have other questions in the chat box. Would you like me to read them with my heavy accent or?
Should I select somebody else to read them?
Should I spare everyone the torture?
No, you're not torturing. We've got what did we agree? We've got about another 10 minutes, right? So, no, it's not a torture for me. Go ahead. Susan.
Did you find them?
You want me to find your questions?
So let me ask. Patrick was asking, sometimes as a loss and grief-oriented therapist, I find that I am attempting to restore grief as a good thing rather than a bad thing, as if funerals and loss have to be about sorrow, whereas grief may be considered an honoring of a way to lovingly remember and celebrate the depth of the love that existed. That is the source of the loss.
Exists in the relationship, yes. It's a you could say it's a celebration of a relationship that was helpful, that was wonderful, and it's now over. Yeah, I like that. Yeah.
I'm not sure I'm pronouncing the name right. Unye, I guess, is asking how to help a client with a feeling of pain in the chest, a stone, a knife, and a heart.
I can't find the question. What is Unye asking again?
How to help a client with a feeling of pain in a chest, a stone, a knife, and a heart.
Wait. Well, I don't know the context. I mean, I think the first thing I need to know is what are the field conditions? What is the situation that the client is describing in which he or she experiences this metaphor of a stone or a knife in the heart? And what does that actually feel like? I don't know if it has anything to do with grief. It may have something to do with fear. It may have something to do with something else. I don't know. But how would I work with it? I invite the client to pay attention to their body, to how they experience that stone, how they experience that here and now, to be the stone, to talk to the stone, to be the stone and talk back. I don't know. I'm still in the classical mode of Gestalt therapy, but it doesn't mean that it's not a relational approach. It's still a relationship between something that the object here is the stone, and the relationship is some kind of connection with some alienated aspect of myself. That is a relationship, and so it's still relational, but I just don't know much more about it. I don't know what the stone or the relationship with the stone means, because I have the figure, which is the stone, but I don't have the background. And to know what it means, I want to work with what is the background that supports this figure, this stone. Then we can have some kind of significant dialogue. But it starts just uncovering and sharpening that figure and trying to clarify what is the support for that figure that this client brings. What is it about, uniquely about this client, that this is his experience or her experience? What does that mean? I need to know the background.
Okay, we still have few questions. Do you think that grief and guilt are the two sides of the coin?
Grief and guilt.
Guilt.
Yeah. I do see guilt as one of the most often interruptions of grieving. The reason for that, for me, my understanding is that grieving is usually at the end of a process, when it comes time to say enough. I'm satisfied and I need now to let go and move on. Whenever I do that, I need to let go of that relationship that has now satisfied my need, and it's time to move on. There is a rupture, there is a loss, and whenever there's a loss, there is some grieving that is required in order to adequately move on. Grieving is not a bad word. It's fine. It's just a description of a healthy process of detachment. But it has very bad connotations for some people. But it's actually not. So the problem with guilt is that guilt is one of the reasons people use to avoid grieving. How can I do this? How can I live a life happily? Da 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 da, and it becomes their yes but moment, and it remains stuck. And yes, if you want to avoid grieving, it works. I'm not there to tell them they have to grieve. I'm there to offer them the options. You can take the horse to water, but you can't make him drink. All I can do at that point, where the person is confronted with a decision, and the decision is finely balanced, and they have an ambivalence they have a dilemma. Do I go that way or do I stay in the past? Do I go that way or do I stay in the past? This requirement that they make a commitment and make a decision about who they are is not something that I, as a therapist, can choose for them. There's got to be their choice. And I can sit, and I will sit, but there's nothing about me trying to make the decision for them. Oh, it's much better if you do this. I'm not going to do that. That's not my pay scale. I don't get paid enough to make that decision. All right, I see it's about past, and I'm wondering if we've had enough.
People are excited to hear your voice. They are thanking you, and we have a few questions and comments. What would you like to do?
Well, I would. You guys are not exhausted? Well, I don't know where you are. Okay. Well, let's do some more questions then. But I'm going to stop in 10 minutes.
Okay, great. So how can we help clients to grieve when they keep returning to their past loss of having not good enough parents?
How do we overcome the experience of having not good enough parents?
Yeah.
That's a really tough one. And one of the difficulties with that is, I mean, I'm thinking of the worst case scenario of good enough, of bad parenting. The problem with that is that you grow up, the child grows up without having a necessarily an appreciation of when enough is enough. They don't know when to stop. And so a lot of the, I mean, this is just a generalization because it's a general question, but a lot of the functioning of that person is focused primarily around the experience of the lack of certain needs being validated. And they spend an enormous amount of time trying to come back to organizing the environment, others, to validate their need. So I'm thinking here about the kind of, and I don't want to, it's a general answer. I'm thinking now of the kind of disturbances that people then have to manage to find again a sense of basic trust, which is missing, and to give up their unaware manipulations, unaware processes of getting others to love them or to care for them or to give them what they felt they lacked in childhood. And they still maintain those childlike relationships to do that. And that needs to change. Those relationships are very much stuck in the past. So it's a huge challenge for those people, to those kinds of clients, to get some help. Often they feel very self-conscious and ashamed. They don't want that. They don't want to even come for help. I'm thinking about some people who experience some eating disorders, drug abuse, addictions, personality disorders, when there's a correlation between poor parenting and a lack of organismic experience of satisfaction. They just don't know when to stop. And they don't serve themselves very well, but they get terrified if they stop. They think nobody loves them. I don't know if that answers that question.
Can we take one more question?
Okay, last question. Yeah.
Let me just find it. Stephanie, yes. Can you please give an example of existential guilt and how it is identified and worked on during sessions?
And what's the last phrase?
How do you work on it during the sessions?
Ah, okay. I believe I'm a good person, and I try to do that all the time. But today I was in an incredible hurry. I'm making up a story, but it could be true. And there's a man sitting on the side of the road, obviously needing some help. But I'm late. And I step over him and I go my way. But I notice him. But now I'm sitting with a dilemma. I have a certain value system around which I've organized my identity. This is who I am. I'm a nice person. You gotta like me. You can't be mad at me. But look what I just did. Is that ethically okay? And part of me says, you know, all of this nice thing, is this just your ego or your narcissism or something else? If you're a human being, how do you do that to another human being? What kind of value system do you have? Now, people have that conflict sometimes. They have to make some very tough decisions. The one that I gave is rather silly, but some of our clients come with very, very difficult existential decisions. Do I leave my country and go and take my family somewhere else, but leave my old parents where they are and hope for the best? What does that say about me? And there's no sitting on the fence. I have to make a decision. Now, this kind of existential moment is what I'm talking about when I talk about existential guilt. How to reconcile two different values in a particular situation where I need to choose one or the other. And of course, I feel badly about the one or the other. But how do what do I have, how can I resolve this dilemma and find a way to continue living in a healthy way, living well? No, it's not so simple. What am I going to do? That's an example. How do I work with people like that? Patiently. I can't answer that question. They need to find their answer that works for them. They can do it in a dialogue with me. They can do it by bringing their family in the room, by bringing their parents into the room. Having these, metaphorically, having these discussions and trying to come to some most reasonable, for them, comfortable place. And sometimes it requires not just working in the room, but face-to-face dialogue. I mean, that's obviously, I'm talking about people who are alive. You know, do you leave your parents in a war zone, or do you to take your family out, or what do you do? And these are not easy. You know, there are wives that leave their husbands because of war, for example, because of different things. Or how do you choose amongst different costs of treatment for 2 children? These are really difficult decisions, and they really test you about what are your values. This is not a simple place. And no, I don't have those answers. But that's not my job to answer that question. It's my job to support them by creating the conditions for awareness where they can stay in contact, where they can make contact with the dilemma fully, and then that contact will show them their way. Not my way, their way. I may not like their decision that they make, but it's not my call. I don't know if that answers that question. Tricky one. Patience. Some people never make that decision. On that happy note, I'm going to say goodbye to everybody. Thank you for listening. Thank you for being here. I hope that this was great. If you want to make a donation to Maria's NGO, please feel free. She won't say no. Take care, all of you. All right.
Thank you so much, Jay. Thank you. Thank you, everyone. It was a real pleasure. Hope to see you soon, Jay.
Okay. Take care. Bye-bye, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.
Welcome.